December 16, 1944. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. Sergeant Michael Kowalski pressed his face against the frost-covered periscope of his Sherman tank, watching German Tiger tanks emerge from the morning mist like prehistoric monsters materializing from legend into terrible reality. The radio crackled with panicked voices from other American units as the full weight of Hitler's last great offensive crashed into their thinly held lines. What the German Panzer crews could not know, what the confident Wehrmacht commanders planning this desperate gamble had catastrophically miscalculated, was that they were not facing a limited force that could be overwhelmed through superior tactics and individual tank quality. They were colliding with the unstoppable momentum of American industrial capacity, a production machine that had already delivered more Sherman tanks in the previous 6 months than Germany had built of all tank types since 1939. The mathematics of this battle had been decided not in the forests of Belgium but in the factories of Detroit, and the numbers told a story that German military planning had refused to believe until it was far too late. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The battle that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge represented the collision of two fundamentally different philosophies of mechanized warfare. The German approach emphasized quality over quantity, building Tigers and Panthers that were engineering marvels, heavily armored and mounting guns that could destroy Allied tanks at ranges where return fire was impossible. The American approach prioritized production volume, mechanical reliability, and the logistical capability to maintain armor forces and sustained operations far from home manufacturing bases. For 3 years, German tank crews had enjoyed technical superiority that made individual engagements feel like unfair fights where American tankers died in numbers that would have broken less determined forces. But wars are not won by individual tank duels. They are won by nations that can replace losses faster than the enemy can inflict them, that can maintain supply lines across oceans and continents, and that can sustain production even while fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously. Germany had built approximately 25,000 tanks of all types during the entire war. The United States had built nearly 50,000 Sherman tanks alone, and they were still rolling off assembly lines at a pace that German planners found literally incredible when intelligence reports provided the figures. Sergeant Michael Kowalski had grown up in the steel mills of Pittsburgh, where his Polish immigrant father worked blast furnaces that turned iron ore into the structural metal that built American cities. The Kowalski household had been shaped by the immigrant experience, the belief that America represented opportunity unavailable in the old country, and the conviction that hard work could create better lives for the next generation. Michael had worked summers in the mills during high school, learning to respect both the incredible industrial capability that American manufacturing represented and the men whose labor made that capability real rather than theoretical. When he enlisted in the Army 3 days after Pearl Harbor at age 19, he brought with him an understanding that wars were won not just by brave soldiers but by the industrial foundations that equipped and supplied those soldiers. His assignment to armored forces felt almost predestined given his background around heavy machinery and his comfort with the mechanical systems that intimidated many farm boys who had never operated anything more complex than a tractor. The Sherman tank that Kowalski commanded in December 1944 was officially designated the medium tank M4A3. Powered by a Ford GAA V8 engine producing 500 horsepower, armed with a 75mm main gun and multiple machine guns for infantry defense. The Sherman represented a design philosophy emphasizing reliability, ease of maintenance, and production efficiency over the maximum armor protection or gun power that German designs prioritized. American military planners had made a calculated decision that it was better to have large numbers of good tanks that crews could be rapidly trained to operate and that could be maintained under field conditions than small numbers of superior tanks that required extensive crew training and sophisticated maintenance infrastructure. This decision had been controversial, particularly among American tank crews who faced German armor and discovered that their shells often bounced off enemy armor while German guns could penetrate Sherman armor at ranges that made return fire impossible. Tankers had given the Sherman dark nicknames reflecting their awareness of its vulnerabilities. They called it the Ronson after the cigarette lighter company whose advertising promised their product lit the first time every time, a grim joke about how quickly Shermans could catch fire when penetrated. They called it the Tommy Cooker, suggesting the speed with which the interior became a crematorium for the crew. Yet the Sherman had attributes that were less dramatic than armor thickness but equally important for sustained operations. The tank was designed with a lower profile than German heavies, making it harder to spot and hit at distance. The suspension system allowed relatively high road speeds and better cross-country mobility than the heavier German designs that often bogged down in mud or broke down from the mechanical stress of carrying so much weight. The main gun, while less powerful than German tank guns, could be rapidly reloaded and was highly effective against the lighter German tanks and assault guns that constituted the majority of enemy armor. Most importantly, the Sherman was designed for mass production using techniques borrowed from automotive manufacturing, and it was designed to be reparable under field conditions by crews with basic mechanical training rather than requiring factory-level expertise to maintain. The crew that Kowalski commanded reflected the American approach to armored warfare, prioritizing teamwork and systematic training over the individual excellence that German forces emphasized. The driver, Corporal James Washington, had grown up in rural Georgia working on farm equipment, developing an intuitive mechanical sense that made him one of the best drivers in the company despite having only a 10th grade education. Washington could feel through the controls when the transmission was under excessive strain or when track tension was off, making adjustments that prevented breakdowns before they occurred. His ability to maneuver the 30-ton vehicle through difficult terrain while maintaining situational awareness of what the rest of the crew needed often meant the difference between getting into firing position or being caught exposed when enemy tanks appeared. The gunner, Private First Class Anthony Rizzo, came from a working-class Italian family in Brooklyn, where his father operated a small machine shop producing precision parts for various manufacturers. Rizzo had grown up around precision machinery and had developed the steady hands and depth perception judgment required for accurate gunnery. He could estimate range based on visual cues that other gunners missed, adjusting his aim to compensate for the target's movement and the ballistic drop of the 75mm shell over distance. His consistency in hitting targets on the first or second shot had earned him recognition as one of the battalion's best gunners, a skill that had saved the crew multiple times when encountering enemy armor. The assistant driver and bow gunner, Private Danny Sullivan, was the youngest member of the crew at 18 years old, having enlisted immediately after graduating from high school in Boston despite his mother's tearful objections to her only son going to war. Sullivan operated the bow-mounted machine gun and assisted Washington with driving duties, but his primary value came from his sharp eyesight and ability to spot enemy positions before others noticed them. He had a hunter's patience and attention to detail, probably developed during childhood summers spent in rural New Hampshire with relatives who taught him to track deer through forests. That same observational skill translated directly to spotting camouflaged German positions or detecting movement that indicated enemy activity. The loader, Private Robert Chen, represented the changing face of the American military, a Chinese-American from San Francisco whose family had operated a grocery store in Chinatown before the war. Chen had faced discrimination and suspicion despite his family having lived in America for 2 generations, but military service offered both proof of loyalty and escape from the limited opportunities civilian life provided to those who did not look like the majority. He was slightly built compared to the others but possessed endurance that allowed him to maintain the physical demands of loading 75mm shells repeatedly during combat without the fatigue that slowed larger men. His efficiency in loading, his ability to select the correct ammunition type without hesitation, and his maintenance of the ready ammunition racks contributed directly to the tank's combat effectiveness. These 5 men had trained together at Fort Knox, Kentucky, learning to operate as a coordinated unit where each member's actions supported the others. They had shipped overseas together, landed in France 2 weeks after D-Day, and fought their way across France and into Belgium through months of combat that had transformed them from trained soldiers into experienced veterans. They had learned lessons that training could not fully convey about how armor combat actually unfolded, about the importance of using terrain for protection, about the necessity of infantry-tank cooperation, and about the terrible vulnerability they faced when encountering German heavy tanks that could destroy them before they could get close enough to return effective fire. The German offensive that erupted on December 16 had achieved complete tactical surprise despite intelligence indicators that American headquarters had either dismissed or failed to properly interpret. The Ardennes sector was thinly held, considered a quiet area where inexperienced units could gain familiarity with front-line conditions and where veteran units could rest and refit after heavy combat elsewhere. The Americans had 4 divisions spread across an 80-mile front, a density far below what military doctrine recommended for defensive positions. The Germans had concentrated 24 divisions, including several panzer divisions equipped with the formidable Tiger and Panther tanks that represented the peak of German armored vehicle design. The initial German assault achieved penetrations that threatened to split the American forces and potentially reach the vital port of Antwerp, which supplied the entire Allied advance into Germany. Kampfgruppe, an armored battle group commanded by SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Paper, spearheaded the northern thrust with approximately 100 tanks, including heavy Tigers that smashed through American defensive positions. The Tiger tank mounted an 88mm gun that had been developed originally as an anti-aircraft weapon but proved devastatingly effective against Allied armor. The gun could penetrate the frontal armor of a Sherman at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters, while the Sherman's 75mm gun could barely penetrate Tiger armor even at point-blank range from the side or rear. The disparity created situations where German tank commanders could engage American armor with near impunity, knowing that return fire posed minimal threat unless the Americans could maneuver to very close range and target specific weak points. Kowalski's tank platoon had been positioned near the town of Stillmont when the German offensive began, part of the 7th Armored Division's defensive positions that were supposed to represent a quiet sector. The first indication that something catastrophic was unfolding came through radio traffic, frantic reports from units to the south describing massive German attacks with armor and infantry penetrating defensive lines. Then came the refugees, Belgian civilians streaming west with whatever possessions they could carry, fleeing the advancing Germans and bringing with them stories of panzer columns and SS troops executing prisoners. The company commander assembled the tank crews for a hurried briefing that provided more questions than answers. German forces had broken through in multiple locations. Friendly units were falling back or being overrun. Their orders were to establish blocking positions and delay the German advance until reinforcements could arrive to stabilize the situation. The concept sounded straightforward in the briefing, but the reality proved far more complex and terrifying. Establishing blocking positions meant finding terrain that provided some protection while offering clear fields of fire toward likely German approach routes. It meant coordinating with infantry who would protect the tanks from German infantry armed with Panzerfaust anti-tank rockets that could destroy a Sherman from close range. It meant maintaining communication with adjacent units and with headquarters while the radio net became increasingly chaotic with units reporting contact, requesting support, or simply going silent as they were overrun. Most critically, it meant facing the psychological challenge of holding position when every instinct screamed to retreat before being surrounded and destroyed. Kowalski positioned his tank hull down behind a slight rise that protected the lower hull while allowing the turret to observe and engage targets. The location provided a clear view of the road approaching from the east, the most likely avenue for German armor to use given the difficult terrain on either side. Infantry from an attached rifle company dug foxholes nearby, creating a combined defense where the tank's firepower and the infantry's ability to engage enemy infantry with small arms fire would hopefully create a position that could hold against initial German probes. The assistant driver Sullivan used binoculars to scan the tree line approximately 1,000 meters distant, looking for any movement that might indicate approaching enemy forces. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The waiting proved almost as difficult as combat itself. The temperature hovered around freezing, and the interior of the Sherman offered only marginally better protection than outside. The crew wore every piece of clothing they could layer under their coveralls, but the cold still penetrated, creating a bone-deep chill that made it difficult to maintain alertness. Kowalski rotated crew members through brief periods outside the tank to warm themselves with thermite grenades used carefully to provide heat without creating visible flame that might attract German artillery. The crew ate cold rations, sea rations that were barely palatable when heated and became actively unpleasant when eaten cold, but hot food would require fires that were forbidden given their exposed position. The first contact came not with enemy armor but with German infantry, advanced scouts probing American positions to identify defensive strengths and weaknesses before committing armor to the attack. Sullivan spotted movement in the tree line, figures moving between trees in the characteristic bounds that indicated trained infantry advancing under tactical control. Kowalski reported the sighting to the company commander and received permission to engage if the enemy approached within 500 meters. The German infantry never came that close, apparently satisfied with confirming that this position was occupied and defended. They withdrew back into the forest, and Kowalski knew this meant German commanders were now planning how to reduce this position with armor and artillery support. The artillery came first, German heavy guns firing from positions kilometers behind the front line, delivering high-explosive shells that created massive explosions, sending shrapnel and concussion waves across the defensive positions. The tank provided protection from shell fragments, but the concussion from nearby impacts was terrifying even through armor plate. The infantry in their foxholes faced far worse exposure, enduring an experience that killed men through the psychological stress as much as through actual wounds. The barrage lasted 20 minutes that felt like hours, systematic German gunnery working over the defensive positions with professional thoroughness. When the artillery finally lifted, Kowalski knew the armor would be coming next, exploiting the disruption and casualties the bombardment had created. Through the commander's periscope, Kowalski watched the tree line, knowing the Germans would emerge soon but uncertain exactly where or in what strength. The morning mist had thickened during the artillery barrage, reducing visibility to perhaps 400 meters, close enough that German tanks would be nearly on top of them before clear shots became possible. The radio crackled with reports from other positions, all confirming what Kowalski already knew. German armor was advancing along the entire front, and American forces were heavily outnumbered and outgunned. Then the first German tank emerged from the mist, and Kowalski felt his stomach clench with fear as he recognized the profile of a Tiger, its massive bulk and long gun barrel identifying it unmistakably even through the poor visibility. The Tiger was buttoned up, hatches closed, the commander inside using his periscopes to scan for targets rather than exposing himself by looking directly over the armor. The tank moved with surprising speed despite weighing nearly 60 tons, its Maybach engine providing enough power to maintain tactical mobility despite the massive armor protection that made it nearly invulnerable to American tank guns from the front. Kowalski's immediate instinct was to fire, to engage the threat before it spotted them, but training and experience overrode that panic response. Firing from this range against Tiger frontal armor would accomplish nothing except revealing their position. The 75mm shell would bounce off the Tiger's thick armor plate, and the German commander would immediately know where the threat was located. The Tiger's 88mm gun would reply, and at 400 meters even a hull-down Sherman offered insufficient protection. Their only chance was to let the Tiger pass, hoping to get a shot at the side or rear armor where penetration was possible, or to hold fire entirely and hope the Tiger moved past without spotting their position. The decision was made even more complicated by the appearance of a second Tiger following the first, and then a third, a full platoon of German heavy tanks advancing with the confidence of crews who knew their vehicles were nearly invulnerable to anything the Americans could throw at them. Behind the Tigers came lighter German tanks, probably Panzer IVs based on their silhouettes, and supporting infantry moving in half-tracks. This was not a probe or limited attack. This was a major German thrust, and Kowalski's position was directly in its path. The company commander's voice came over the radio net, tense but controlled, giving the order that every tank commander had been dreading. They were to hold position and engage the German column, accepting that they faced overwhelming enemy strength but trusting that delaying the German advance even briefly would allow other units to establish defensive positions further west. It was a death sentence delivered in professional military terminology, an order that asked them to sacrifice themselves to buy time for others. Kowalski acknowledged the order with a simple "Roger," keeping his voice steady even though his hands were shaking on the controls. Rizzo was already traversing the turret, tracking the lead Tiger as it moved across their front, waiting for the order to fire. Washington had the engine running at idle, ready to reverse their position immediately after firing to avoid the return fire that would inevitably come. Chin had an armor-piercing round loaded, the most powerful ammunition they carried, though everyone knew it was inadequate against Tiger frontal armor. Sullivan scanned for targets, trying to identify whether any lighter German vehicles offered better engagement opportunities. Kowalski forced himself to breathe slowly, to think clearly despite the adrenaline flooding his system. The Tigers were moving past their position, apparently unaware that American armor was dug in barely 400 meters away. If they held fire, the Tigers might continue past, leaving the lighter German tanks and infantry as targets that the Sherman could engage more effectively. But allowing the Tigers to pass meant those monsters would be behind them, able to attack from the rear while the German column pinned them from the front. There were no good options, only degrees of terrible. The lead Tiger suddenly stopped, its turret traversing slowly as the commanders scanned the American positions. Someone in the German crew had spotted something, perhaps the slight reflection off the Sherman's periscope glass, perhaps tracks in the snow leading to their position, perhaps simply the instinct that comes from experience that something was wrong. The Tigers' long gun barrel swung toward their position with terrible finality, and Kowalski knew their brief moment of advantage had evaporated. The words came out automatically, trained response overriding conscious thought. "Gunner, target tank. Fire." Rizzo triggered the main gun, the Sherman rocking backward from the recoil as the 75mm shell crossed the distance to the Tiger in less than a second. The round struck the Tiger's frontal armor at an angle and ricocheted upward, the impact visible as a bright spark but causing no apparent damage to the massive German tank. Washington was already reversing, backing the Sherman down the reverse slope to break line of sight with the German tanks, the move executed perfectly through endless practice. The Tiger's return shot arrived a heartbeat later, the 88mm shell passing through the space where the Sherman had been seconds earlier and impacting the ground beyond with a thunderous explosion. Kowalski knew they had perhaps 30 seconds before the Tigers repositioned to engage their new location, 30 seconds to decide whether to stay and fight from a different position or to begin withdrawing toward the next defensive line. The decision was made for him by the radio, the company commander ordering all tanks to begin fighting withdrawal, engaging and displacing repeatedly to delay the German advance while avoiding being surrounded and destroyed. What Kowalski could not know in that moment of tactical crisis, what none of the German commanders planning this offensive fully understood, was that they were not facing a limited force that could be overwhelmed through local superiority. They were engaging the forward elements of an industrial system that had built more Sherman tanks in the previous year than Germany had built of all tank types in the entire war. Behind the American lines, replacement tanks were already moving forward to replace losses. In the ports, more tanks were being unloaded from Liberty ships that crossed the Atlantic in convoys protected by naval forces that Germany could no longer effectively challenge. In Detroit, in Cleveland, in dozens of factories across the American industrial heartland, workers were building more tanks, more vehicles, more of everything needed to sustain mechanized warfare at a scale that Germany could not match regardless of how superior individual German tanks might be in direct combat. The German Panzer crews advancing through the Ardennes that December morning were about to discover that tactical excellence and superior equipment could not overcome strategic disadvantages. They were learning the lesson that would define modern industrial warfare, that nations capable of producing overwhelming material superiority would eventually prevail regardless of how skilled or determined their opponents might be. The Battle of the Bulge would become the demonstration that American industrial might, when fully mobilized and directed toward military production, could bury enemy forces under avalanches of equipment and supplies that made individual equipment advantages irrelevant. The Germans were facing not just an army but the combined output of the most productive industrial economy in human history, and that economy was producing Shermans faster than Germany could destroy them. The mathematics of that equation had already determined the outcome. The fighting that followed would simply be the brutal process of making that mathematical reality manifest through blood and burning metal. Michael Kowalski had been born in 1922 in the Polish Hill neighborhood of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, a community where the streets bore names that reflected the dreams and heritage of families who had crossed an ocean seeking opportunities unavailable in the old country. His father, Stefan Kowalski, had arrived at Ellis Island in 1910 at the age of 17 with $8 in his pocket and the address of a distant cousin who worked in the steel mills that dominated Pittsburgh's industrial landscape. Stefan had found work within a week of arrival, joining the thousands of immigrant laborers whose physical strength and willingness to endure brutal conditions powered the furnaces that produced the steel girders, railway tracks, and structural components that were quite literally building modern America. The work in the mills was dangerous in ways that modern safety regulations would never permit. Men worked 12-hour shifts in temperatures that exceeded 130 degrees Fahrenheit, operating equipment that could kill instantly if attention wandered for even a moment. Stefan had witnessed fatal accidents with regularity during his early years, coworkers crushed by equipment failures, burned by molten metal, or simply overcome by heat exhaustion and toxic fumes. The mills paid wages that seemed generous compared to what agricultural work in Poland offered, but those wages came at the cost of physical breakdown that left most mill workers old men by their 40s. Stefan accepted these conditions with the pragmatic stoicism common among immigrants who understood that complaining accomplished nothing while hard work and reliability could lead to advancement. By the time Stefan married Anna Wojcik in 1920, he had worked his way up from general laborer to furnace operator, a position requiring skill and judgment beyond simple physical strength. Operating the blast furnaces meant understanding the chemistry of steel production, recognizing by color and consistency when the molten metal reached proper temperature and composition, and coordinating with other workers to ensure the continuous flow of production that management demanded. The promotion came with modestly higher wages and slightly less physical danger, though the work remained exhausting and the environment remained hostile to human health and longevity. Anna had immigrated with her family in 1912, settling in the same Polish Hill neighborhood where ethnic solidarity provided both practical support and cultural continuity with the homeland most immigrants would never see again. She worked in a textile factory before marriage, operating sewing machines in crowded conditions for wages that barely exceeded what her room and board cost. Marriage to Stefan represented economic security and the opportunity to focus on building a family rather than merely surviving week to week. The couple moved into a small house that Stefan purchased through a building and loan association that served the Polish immigrant community, creating the foundation for the working-class stability they hoped would provide better opportunities for their children. Michael was born 2 years into the marriage, followed by 2 sisters and another brother over the next 8 years. The Kowalski household operated on principles that reflected both old country values and American aspirations. Education was emphasized as the pathway to advancement beyond manual labor, with both parents insisting that their children complete high school even though many immigrant families pulled children out of school as soon as legally permitted to contribute to family income. The family spoke Polish at home but English in public, understanding that language facility determined access to opportunities beyond ethnic enclaves. Church attendance every Sunday was non-negotiable, representing both religious faith and community participation that reinforced ethnic identity and mutual support networks. Michael showed early aptitude for mechanical systems and problem-solving that required understanding how components work together. As a boy, he would disassemble and reassemble household items, driven by curiosity about internal mechanisms rather than any intention to repair broken objects. His father recognized this inclination and began bringing home discarded equipment from the mill, mechanical assemblies that had been replaced during maintenance operations. Michael would spend hours examining these industrial components, figuring out how gears meshed, how valves controlled flow, and how the brutal simplicity of mill equipment reflected design principles that prioritized durability over elegance. By the time Michael entered high school, his father had made a decision that reflected both practical wisdom and recognition of his son's abilities. Rather than pushing Michael toward white-collar work that seemed beyond reach for working-class immigrant families, Stefan arranged for Michael to work summer jobs at the mill, learning the industrial processes and mechanical systems that constituted the foundation of Pittsburgh's economy. The work was physically demanding and often dangerous, but it provided education unavailable in any classroom about how large-scale manufacturing actually functioned, how teams of workers coordinated complex operations, and how individual competence directly affected both productivity and safety. Michael worked multiple summers in various mill departments, gaining exposure to different aspects of steel production. He learned to operate cranes that moved tons of material with precision that prevented accidents. He worked in maintenance crews that repaired equipment during brief shutdown windows when every minute of lost production represented significant cost. He assisted engineers who monitored furnace operations and adjusted processes to maintain quality standards while maximizing output. The experience was transformative in ways that shaped his entire approach to work and problem solving. He learned that complex operations succeeded through attention to detail rather than dramatic innovations, that teams functioned effectively when each member understood both their specific role and how that role connected to larger objectives, and that dangerous environments required constant vigilance rather than momentary caution. The onset of the Great Depression in 1929 affected the Kowalski family as it affected millions of American families, though the impact was less severe than what many experienced. Steel production declined dramatically as construction and manufacturing collapsed, but Stefan's skills and seniority protected him from the worst layoffs that devastated less experienced workers. The family endured reduced hours and lower wages but never faced the complete destitution that drove some families to homelessness or reliance on emergency relief. The experience of watching neighbors lose everything reinforced Michael's understanding that economic security was never guaranteed and that developing valuable skills provided the best protection against forces beyond individual control. Michael graduated from high school in 1940 with grades that were solid if not exceptional, reflecting a practical intelligence focused on applied knowledge rather than academic theory. He had no illusions about attending college, understanding that higher education remained beyond the financial reach of working-class families even as the Depression slowly released its grip on the economy. His father arranged a position for him at the mill, operating equipment that required mechanical aptitude and careful attention but offered little prospect for significant advancement. Michael accepted this future without resentment, understanding that steady employment and skilled work represented success by the standards of his community. The fall of France in June 1940 penetrated American consciousness in ways that European conflicts had not previously managed. The shocking collapse of the French military, which had been considered among the world's most powerful armies, demonstrated that modern warfare had evolved beyond the static trench combat of World War I. The newsreels showing German tanks sweeping across France and German infantry goose-stepping through Paris created awareness that military technology and tactical innovation had created new forms of warfare where speed and mechanization determined outcomes. Michael watched these developments with growing conviction that American involvement was inevitable regardless of public sentiment favoring neutrality. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, Michael began following war news with increased attention. The scale of the Eastern Front battles, involving millions of soldiers and thousands of tanks, suggested that this conflict would ultimately be decided by industrial capacity as much as military skill. Germany was fighting enemies who collectively possessed greater populations and industrial resources, creating a mathematical equation that seemed likely to favor the Allies if the war continued long enough for those resources to be fully mobilized. Michael discussed these developments with co-workers during lunch breaks, many of whom had family in Poland suffering under German occupation and who followed news from Europe with personal investment impossible for those without direct connections. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941 eliminated any remaining debate about American involvement. Michael heard the news on the radio while working a Sunday shift at the mill, the announcement interrupting regular programming to report that Japanese aircraft had attacked the American naval base in Hawaii. The immediate emotional response was anger mixed with determination, the feeling that an unprovoked attack demanded retaliation regardless of cost. Michael made his decision that afternoon, finishing his shift and then walking directly to the Army recruiting station that he knew would be opening despite the Sunday schedule given the circumstances. The recruiting office was already crowded with young men motivated by the same mixture of patriotic duty and personal conviction that had driven Michael. The sergeant processing enlistments asked about background and preferences for service branch, explaining that the Army offered various specialties beyond infantry service. When Michael mentioned his industrial experience and mechanical aptitude, the sergeant immediately suggested armor forces, explaining that the Army was rapidly expanding tank units and needed men who understood machinery and could function as part of coordinated crews. The description appealed to Michael's practical nature, offering the opportunity to apply existing skills rather than starting completely from zero in some specialty requiring extensive training. The enlistment process was surprisingly swift, consisting mostly of basic medical examination to ensure physical fitness and paperwork documenting his civilian background. Michael signed the forms committing him to military service for the duration of the war plus 6 months, a time frame that could mean years depending on how long the conflict lasted. He left the recruiting station with orders to report for basic training in 3 weeks, barely enough time to settle his affairs and say goodbye to family and friends who were simultaneously proud of his decision and terrified about what military service might mean. His father's response to the enlistment was complex, mixing pride in his son's willingness to serve with fear about the dangers military service represented. Stefan had not served in World War I, having been too young when it began and too settled in America by the time American entry might have required his participation. He had watched that war from a distance, reading newspaper accounts of catastrophic casualties and industrial-scale slaughter that seemed to accomplish little beyond destroying a generation of young men. The prospect of his own son facing similar dangers created an emotional response that he struggled to articulate, eventually settling on simple admonitions to be careful and come home safely. His mother's reaction was more openly emotional, tears and prayers mixed with the kind of fatalistic acceptance common among women who understood that men made decisions about war while women endured the consequences. She made Michael promise to write regularly, to attend Mass whenever possible, and to remember that courage did not require unnecessary risks. She prepared meals that featured all his favorite foods during the remaining weeks before departure, creating memories and connections that she hoped would sustain him during whatever hardships lay ahead. Basic training at Fort Knox, Kentucky introduced Michael to military life with the systematic efficiency that the Army had refined over decades of turning civilians into soldiers. The training emphasized physical conditioning, basic infantry skills, and the military discipline that would allow large organizations to function effectively under stressful conditions. Michael adapted to the structure and demands more easily than many recruits, his industrial work experience having already taught him to follow instructions precisely and to function as part of teams where individual preferences were subordinated to collective objectives. The physical conditioning was demanding but not beyond his capability, and he discovered that he actually enjoyed the weapons training and tactical exercises that taught small unit combat skills. After completing basic training, Michael was assigned to armored forces training that would teach him to operate and fight from tanks. The training took place at Fort Knox, which had become the center for American armored doctrine and training. The initial phase focused on familiarizing soldiers with the various armored vehicles in American service, starting with light tanks and progressing to the medium tanks that would become the backbone of American armored forces. Michael's first direct exposure to the M4 Sherman tank created impressions that were mixed. The vehicle was larger and more complex than anything he had previously operated, requiring coordination between 5 crew members to function effectively. The armor protection and firepower were impressive by civilian standards, but the instructors were frank about the limitations compared to German tanks that American forces would eventually face. The training curriculum covered every aspect of tank operations from basic mechanical maintenance to advanced tactical employment. Michael qualified initially as a loader, the crew position requiring physical endurance to repeatedly lift and load 75mm shells during combat operations. The work was exhausting during training exercises and would be even more demanding under actual combat conditions, but Michael approached it with the same systematic competence he had developed in industrial work. The training gradually built complexity, starting with individual crew position tasks and progressing to full crew coordination exercises where all 5 positions had to work together seamlessly. Michael proved particularly adept at understanding how the various crew positions interrelated and how effective tank operations required each member to anticipate what others needed. This systems-level understanding, developed during his mill work where large operations required coordination between many workers, translated directly to tank crew operations. His instructors recognized this aptitude and began considering him for eventual promotion to tank commander, the position requiring both technical knowledge and leadership capability to manage the crew and make tactical decisions during combat operations. The armor training also included extensive instruction on German tanks and tactics based on combat reports from North Africa where American forces were engaging German armor for the first time. The instructors did not sugarcoat the challenges, explaining frankly that German tanks like the Tiger and Panther had superior armor protection and gun power compared to American vehicles. The training emphasized that American advantages lay in greater numbers, better mechanical reliability, and superior logistics rather than individual tank superiority. American doctrine was built around the concept that overwhelming force and sustained operations would eventually prevail over German tactical excellence, a strategy that required American tankers to accept higher casualties while trusting that their losses would be replaced while German losses would not. Michael completed armor training in the summer of 1943 and was assigned to a newly forming tank battalion that would train together as a unit before deploying overseas. The assignment meant additional months of training focused on battalion-level operations rather than individual tank skills. Michael was promoted to tank commander during this phase, given responsibility for a 5-man crew and a Sherman tank that would become his primary concern for the foreseeable future. The promotion reflected both his demonstrated competence and the Army's need for junior leaders who could function effectively without constant supervision. The crew that was assigned to Michael reflected the American military's practice of combining men from diverse backgrounds into units that would have to function as cohesive teams despite having no prior connection. The diversity created both challenges and opportunities, requiring the crew to build working relationships from scratch while bringing varied experiences and perspectives that could contribute to problem-solving under pressure. Michael approached crew leadership with the same principles he had absorbed in industrial work, emphasizing clear communication, mutual respect, and the understanding that everyone's contribution was essential to collective success. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.